All right, hi 2100 students. Today we're going to talk about contextual factors. I know you've been working on this for your major course assignment on the Utah case study, but we want to talk about what this actually looks like in the classroom and how it impacts teaching so that teachers can make a greater difference with their students. So, to get started. Let's think about all the different contextual factors there are. You've read about these. What do you personally think are the most important things? And it might be family life of your students. It might be household income. It might be race. It might be language. So there's a lot of big things, right? When it comes to contextual factors. When we think about school districts, we think about like the resources available to them, maybe what part of town it's in. There are cultural factors. Certainly here in rural Utah, we have agricultural versus industry. We have religious factors, even political factors. And so of all those things, what would impact your students the most? I think that obviously all the factors matter. And so there's not one thing that determines instruction or determines the culture of a classroom. But it's important to be aware of kind of the big ones. And we know from research that the biggest things are the household factors for your student. In particular, household income, how much your parents make, because that dictates what resources are available to you and what you can do after school. Somebody who can go to summer school and has tutors versus someone who's going home to support their family, right? And so that makes a big difference in their education and in their socialization. A lot of these factors are cultural factors, right? That certain things are espoused or emphasized in one area over another. And so certainly teaching in rural Utah would be different from teaching in inner city New York. And so we have to take these things under consideration. In the article that you read, it talked about the location, the school factors, and the student factors. And I just want to go through some of these really quickly. Here is my hometown, and it's a cute little main street. And I think about the opportunities I had because I was from a working class community, very agricultural, a lot of farmers, a lot of hardworking people, but also not a lot of wealth in my community. We didn't deal with extreme wealth. And at least I wasn't aware of extreme poverty. I'm sure it existed. Contrast that with where my wife grew up in Utah Valley, and neighboring high schools, one would be super, super wealthy and have lots of resources, and the other one would be kind of ghetto and not have as many resources. So those things make a difference. Just where you're at in town or what city you're in versus others, even regionally or even nationally. So communities impact what kind of resources are available in schools, what things are available in homes, what extracurriculars there are. Certainly when it comes to like crime and other safety concerns, that's tied to where you live. And then a big thing is religious, racial diversity. We could talk about even gender identity here and where certain things are more acceptable or less acceptable or accepted, I guess is the better word. Cultural attitudes regarding education, and we know those can vary widely. And then even events and traditions. Here in Cedar City, we put a premium on theater. And so there's lots of opportunities to be involved with Shakespeare or local theater. And so that impacts what happens in the classrooms often. We also, most places, if we were in Texas, we'd talk about football, right? Here in Cedar City, we do have a strong community. There's parades all the time. There's different cool little things. And so those things matter. All right. Thinking about students, obviously you're going to teach a kindergarten class different than you're going to teach a fifth grade class, which is different from how you teach a bunch of juniors in high school. So age is a big factor in cognitive development, where they're at socially. Those are all factors. Gender and gender identity, again, is a big deal. And being able to help students be accepting of one another and doing the same as teachers, of course. the culture of our students and accommodating that in the classroom. And then, of course, personal interests. You're going to have greater success with students if you can find those common grounds, things that you enjoy, that they enjoy, or being genuinely interested in what interests those students. So we want to be able to anticipate our students' needs, and that comes by understanding our students. And so once, like in our assignment, we're going to really dig into the research on the school districts and the individual schools. But once you get your classroom, then you really dig into your students' interests, their backgrounds, and go from there. Now, each school is going to be impacted by both of those things, right? So it's within a community, and how much money that community has will often dictate the size of the school, the resources within that school, what's available to students, and then, of course, those individual students and what is important to them and their families. That's also going to influence what's in these schools. And so we'll find different things from place to place. So a couple questions, and then we're going to dig into some case studies. How can you, or is it even possible to totally differentiate instruction for each of your students? Of course, differentiate is something that we use in education, which simply means to customize the curriculum to the individual needs of each student. So if you have a class of 20 students, can you teach every lesson personalized for each of those 20 students? That's a pretty tall order. So some people would say, no, that's not possible. Others would say there's little subtle little things that you can throw in to tweak the curriculum and to customize it for your students to differentiate that instruction. The reality is somewhere between those two, right? That maybe we'll get an understanding of the whole culture of the school and of the community, and that will impact our curriculum. And then those little things that, as we get to know our students better and better, we throw little things tied to their interests or tied to their abilities or to their culture into what we're talking about in the classroom. And this is a great opportunity. I know some of my favorite experiences in the classroom are, like, I had a really awesome student a few years ago whose family was Indian, and she actually invited me and my family to join them for a few of their festivals and celebrations. And so I got to see that culture a little bit more, and it was really cute because they would like dress up our little daughters in their cute outfits, and they would do dances with them and stuff. It was really fun. But then when there was a religious holiday for this particular student, she was very open and comfortable sharing about it in our class, and then our whole class could ask questions and get to know the student better, but also get to know this part of the culture, which was also a part of our community, a small part of our community, but a part of our community. So there's some opportunities there. Now, the higher number of students, the more difficult it is to do that, right? So when you have 20 or 25 students and you're with them all day long every day, you get to know your students pretty well. The amount of time I've spent with you so far via lecture is like the equivalent of less than one day in the classroom. And so I don't know you guys nearly as well as I would in a K6 setting. If you're a high school teacher and you teach 5 or 6 classes, and each class has 20 or 30 students, now you're dealing with hundreds of students. And so it's going to be harder to differentiate instruction in those situations, but it's not impossible. And that's why we're looking at community factors, school factors, and then individual factors for these students. What can we do to make our classroom a safe place? And this is the first step in differentiating our instruction. Having a place where our students feel like they can ask questions, where they can contribute, where they don't feel like they're going to be judged. And so you have to think about, what can you do as a teacher to create that safe space for them initially, so then you can get to know them better, because they're going to feel more comfortable sharing if they feel like they're not going to be judged, or it's not going to have a negative impact on them. All right, so that takes us here to our case studies. I want to give you a few different kinds of students, and I'm using generalities here. I'm using different groups for the purposes of this assignment. Obviously, not all students are going to fit into any of these groups, or some students will fit into many of these groups. And so we're just going to talk about them hypothetically. Your job is, as I talk about these different student profiles, you need to think about how can you accommodate these students in your classroom? What are little things that you can do to make their lives a little bit easier or better to improve learning? And this is something that you might want to put notes of into your lecture reflection. Excuse me. All right. So let's start with, let's start with this. This is actually great because one of the things that we've done for you, again, you can find this form here by just Googling SUU student teaching, going down to the forms, and then finding the SUU daily lesson plan. And I pulled this up because here in this third column, I often have student teachers who don't feel real confident in filling out this third column, which is meet learner differences. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And so I'm trying to give you some ideas of things that you consider about individual students or a whole class even that you might put in this third column. It's saying, let's identify evidence-based practice to meet specific individual group learner needs and consider content, process, product, and environment. So we're going to think about these student profiles and then think, what would that look like in the classroom? All right, so this is for my face-to-face. So we'll skip that slide and just head on to this. So first group of students, the seemingly disengaged but thoughtful student. Many of you probably identify with this. I know I certainly did. I have a lot of students who would fit this category generally. And even, as a parent, I see this sometimes in my own kids where it's sometimes hard to tell. Are they bored? Are they totally disengaged? Or are they off in their own world, deeply thinking about these things that we're considering as a class? And sometimes it's hard to tell. Now, as an example of this, I put some of the extremes here down. Kids on the autism spectrum often exhibit these behaviors. Introverts, and I would put myself in that camp, often, don't raise their hand, don't participate or offer a lot vocally in the classroom. So shy students, people with social anxiety, there's a lot of students who fit in here. How do we meet their needs? So if you have students in a class who are reluctant to participate, how can we include them? Well, you think about that and you can include your ideas in your lecture reflection, but let me just give you a couple ideas. I know that if I just randomly call on these students, often it will totally stress them out and they'll have a bad experience and then they'll start dreading going to class. And so if I have created a safe environment and that's where we start, then they know that they're not going to be judged, right? One of the things that I love to do in regards to that is think, pair, shares. If you give students a question to consider by themselves, then put them in a very low stakes environment where there's no right or wrong answer. It's an opinion thing, but share it with your neighbor or share it with your group. And then once everyone's had a chance to actually talk about it, then I can randomly call on any student in the class, draw popsicle sticks or put their names in a randomizer or just call on people. And they've already talked about their answer. So it shouldn't feel as stressful at that point to participate in the class. I love using the strategy, especially early in the school year, because if I can do it, and especially with things that are less consequential, like what's your favorite movie, talk to your neighbor about it, and then I'm going to just randomly call on kids in class to share their favorite movie with the class. There's no right or wrong to that. It's an opinion. It's me trying to get to know you and your interests. So it definitely builds with the culture of the classroom. Now, we can also do that with content-specific things, but it's a little more tricky there because now student preparation goes into play, student understanding. And so there you might want to stick more to the small groups and the one-on-one, or let students volunteer their answers rather than randomly calling on students. All right, so that's just one thought. Next group, the seemingly always distracted and disruptive student. I also can relate to this, not because I was a class clown or anything, but because with my ADHD, I have a hard time focusing. I am often distracted and trying to multitask and think of and do a lot of different things all at the same time. And so, that there might be stimulus overload in a class for certain students, where other students seem to thrive by having lots of things going on. And I included here class clowns, extroverts, outgoing students, but I think even students from this previous group, sometimes they act this way and sometimes they act this way. And so it just depends on your situation. But what can we do for the disruptive students? And this is an important one for new teachers, especially. The number one issue that we see with new teachers, and this is universal as we look at the research on what's the biggest challenge that you face as a brand new teacher, it's always classroom management. It's always dealing with those students who want or even need more attention, but they're seeking out that attention in ways that are disruptive to other students and take away from the overall learning in the classroom. So what can we do for these students? I observe this all the time as I see student teachers in the classroom and of course with my own experiences. And what I would say is look for ways to reward progress, to reward good behavior, focus on the positive things rather than focusing on punishment and negative behavior. Give opportunities for students to succeed. So sometimes a student who is doing things that are very disruptive, maybe it's because they're in a position in the classroom where it's really easy to be disruptive. So simply moving them to a different place in the classroom could help that student focus, could help that student work more collaboratively, etc. So sometimes it's as simple as classroom arrangement. Other times it might take giving positive attention, right? So if I have a student who is making offhanded remarks about everything I say, well, that could be an opportunity for me as a teacher to seek out that student one-on-one outside of the classroom, because if I react publicly in the classroom, it's going to make it worse because they're getting attention, which is what they wanted. So if I give them attention in the heat of something and I'm frustrated or whatever, that's simply going to reinforce their bad behaviors. But if I can pull them aside some other time and say, hey, I love your personality. I love that you're making us smile in class. Let's be strategic with this today. So I'm going to want to call on you in these few areas today. Can you prepare in advance and be thinking and even come up with something funny to respond? And I'll be anticipating that. It's going to be really great. Looking for those opportunities to get on the same page with those students, that can really go a long way. Now, of course, you have to be careful with that. Don't overdo it and make sure that you can maintain some dignity within your classroom. But you might need to be creative here. If you have some thoughts on this one, this is one that, of course, we could all do a lot better on. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the lecture reflection. Next case study, students with a barrier. And I say language barrier, but then you'll see here in the examples, some of these things are just communication barriers, right? So an English language learner obviously is going to have a harder time learning in the classroom. And some of the easy helps for that is to translate materials, like have worksheets in multiple languages. Even students really appreciate effort. So if you don't speak their language, if you're not a native speaker of their language, and you wanted to create maybe not every document for them, but maybe one document over a month, and just so they have it in their own language, and you say, look, I used Google Translate to create this, so I bet it's not perfect, but I spent 4 hours working on it. They are going to appreciate that, and they're going to work hard to do their best on that thing because they know that you're invested in them. If you show that you care about them, they're going to reciprocate that more often than not. And so helping students with a language barrier, it could be as simple as doing a translation, getting to know their families, things like that. I've had nonverbal students before, and it was really hard. Sometimes we used whiteboards to communicate with each other. Hearing impaired, fortunately now with technology, I love that like videos that I make like this, I can put on a closed captioning track. And so for an online situation, it's actually easier now than ever before to help with hearing or visually impaired. Visually impaired is an interesting one because obviously we could have students who are completely blind, but more common, and this is common in every classroom, we have students who maybe struggle seeing the board. And so you need to move them to the front row, or you need to move them from one place to another. And so that would be accommodating a learner need, right? So in that third column of our SUU lesson plan, you could even just say, hey, I have one student who can't see very well from the back row. So this class period, I'm going to move them up to the front row and see if it makes a difference. And so you can include things like that in your lesson plans. All right, this next one, hopefully I don't get too emotional here, but this is both one of the hardest things that we deal with as a teacher, but can potentially be one of the most rewarding, and that is dealing with students in the midst of crisis. You almost assuredly will have students at any level, and I have this with my college students, students who their parents are fighting or going through a divorce, students who are struggling with gender identity or feeling not accepted by a particular group, a death in the family, an injury, and sometimes injuries or illnesses can be prolonged, right? So maybe you'll have a student on crutches for months and months. That's going to impact their how they work within a classroom. And so anticipating these students' needs, these all have to be on a one-on-one individualized basis, right? Because if, for example, if a student just went through a traumatic thing, for one student saying, hey, let's give you a couple weeks to mourn or to adjust or whatever, and then we'll ease back into schoolwork. So I'm going to exempt you from certain assignments. That might be really good for some students, but other students might benefit by throwing themselves into their work and not having that time off. And so the important thing here is understanding your students and understanding what they feel will help them best without them taking advantage of the situation or advantage of you. However, if you're going to err on the side of compassion and kindness here, right? If a student's going through a hard thing and maybe they are suffering academically, and maybe that even has long-term implications. If they feel that their teacher cares about them, is doing their best to support and love them, that's more important than having a high GPA, at least in my opinion. So here I am on my soapbox. But this is something one-on-one. As far as what we can do as teachers, the same thing we would do for our friends, for our children, to show kindness and compassion. I love one of the things that we started doing as a family a while ago is when we knew someone was struggling with something, even if we didn't know what that something was, we would go to the dollar store and create a hug box where we just get lots of cheap little treats and toys and just snacks and stuff like that. We'd put it together in a little box. We'd write them a short note that just says, hey, we're just thinking about you, wanted to send you this hug. And then drop it off on their porch or hand it to them. And I've done that with students as well, and they're always well received. Those things don't take a lot of time, don't necessarily cost a lot of money, but help somebody feel important. Writing thank you notes or notes of encouragement, that's an easy way to deal with this. Pulling your students aside and simply talking to them can mean the world to certain students. Often we don't know what they're going through, right? And some students will be going through a major traumatic thing, but they don't want to share it publicly. Maybe they don't feel safe or don't want to be vulnerable. We don't know, but you're going to be more likely to be able to help students if you're asking questions. How do you feel today? You know, put your little popsicle stick up on the board in the happy pile or in the sad pile. Doing things like that to start the day goes a long way. Having journaling opportunities at the classroom goes a long way. Simply checking in with students. And this is one of my favorite things I ever did as a K-12 teacher was every once in a while having an aide or another teacher come into my class to do a really easy to monitor thing like read a book with my students. And then while they're reading with the whole class, I would pull students out one at a time. I wouldn't be targeting students or anything. I'd do it for everyone. So we'd usually go alphabetically or number order. And I would simply have a sit down check-in with students and tell me how things are going. And it wasn't always about grades, and sometimes it wasn't about grades at all. It'd be, are you making friends? What do you look forward to the most at school? How are things after school? Like, do you look forward to going home? What are your favorite things to do? Stuff like that. Simply having these very low stakes, just conversations with students often help them open up to talking about things that they are struggling with, and then you can support them better on those things. So just something to consider. That's the end of our case studies. I have a few other just questions that I want to cycle through really quickly, just to get your mind thinking. And of course, in your lecture reflection, I'd love to know, what have your teachers done, or what have you considered on things that you could do to help support any of these groups of students or students generally? So just a couple quick questions. What are things about students that impact how they learn in the classroom? So we already talked about that. Sorry, redundant here. Here's a quote that I liked from one of the articles. When kids are loved at home, they come to school to learn. Other kids who aren't loved at home come to school to be loved. And I've certainly seen that. And I say, does this apply to college students? Because I totally believe this. Like I see this with my students, even online, where if they're struggling with mental health, if they're struggling with things at home, are they showing up in this classroom? Almost never, right? It's hard to balance traumatic experiences with focusing on school. And so, what does that mean for us as teachers? How do we support those students? How do we find out what's going on in their lives, and how much is too much? And so that brings us to this. What if students just don't want us to be involved in their lives? What if they don't want us to know what's going on? I think there's a fine line here between respecting those kinds of wishes, but doing what's best for their long-term growth and development. And sometimes you have to ask questions. Sometimes it's like legal obligations, like if you see evidence of abuse, for example, you need to ask questions. You need to refer to professionals in those situations. If students just aren't interested in being friendly with you, can you still ask them questions? You know, what's your favorite ice cream? That it's not, I guess it's personal, but it's not intrusive. And so you can keep things more at that professional level if you're in those situations. All right. What does this look like in other countries? And I bring this up because as I've taught entire courses to students from other countries. I've had different cohorts of students, international students, and I've noticed that for many of my international students, at first it's almost a little frightening to see how informal teachers are here and how teachers get to know students and their interests, because in their home countries it's business, right? You don't get to know your teachers at all. You don't know anything about them. They don't know anything about you. Now, that's not true of all countries, but it is true in some countries. And so if you have students who have that background, you might want to approach them more delicately in your own classroom. So just something to think about there. And then this is something I do with one of my face-to-face classes. Think about a detail in your life, and if your teacher understood that better, how could that make a difference? A lot of teachers do this activity that says, what's something that you wish your teacher understood about you? And this is something where if you want to include this in your reflection this week, I'd love to hear it. Obviously, with my face-to-face class, we talk about this a little bit more, but it's something worth considering. Ask your students, what's something you wish that I knew or understood about you? And often students will open up, and that can make things better for you. We're going to go ahead and end with that today. I think this has gone on long enough. A lot to think about as far as creating an inclusive classroom, and being able to support our students because we understand the contextual factors that impact how they're coming to our classroom. So a lot of things to consider here. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.